Let me hit a couple of these comments, and then I want to move on really quick. Neil goes on to say there's too many terrible and blown calls this year. And he says Booger's crew needs to go. It's actually Boger. But, yeah, I agree. I think that ref crew is the worst in football. And when they had Sunday night, I was like, man, I can't believe they gave him a primetime game, let alone the Packers going up against the 49ers. To me, that was like, I saw that, I was like, this is about to be terrible.
You've complained about them for so many years.
They're awful, and it's hard to put. I don't want to put it just on Jerome Boger, the ref for that crew, the head ref. But when you're the face of everything that's like going wrong, it is by far like every time I watch them on the Titans game, I'm like, we're gonna lose every time because I know the penalties are about to just be like the weirdest and most random things you've ever seen in your life. This goes all the way back to the Titans playing the Dolphins, where Matt Castle threw a 20-yard incompletion. They ruled it a fumble and let the Dolphins pick it up and return it for a touchdown. Like he threw the ball 20 yards. Anyway, yeah, worst crew in football. It's not even close. Don't know why they gave him a primetime game. They should be out there calling like Jaguars Jets every week.
Do they play every week?
One of those two games, that crew needs to be on it. But realistically, Drew, it brings me to our next point that I want to talk about. We can harp about where we were right. We can harp about where we were wrong. And just like always, we're running long. So I'm going to try to push us along to our next topic. And it is the NFL. And I really want to get everybody else's kind of opinion on this in the comment section because, we don't know everything. But is the NFL trying to keep these games close with the way that they're being called and the way they're being refereed? Now, I know personally, I want to hope this isn't the case. I want to hope that, man, everything's on the level. The refs are just making some mistakes. It's always, it's human error, right? It's not something that has any sort of malicious intent behind it, or it's not anything that is trying to make the game more entertaining than it would have been otherwise if they would have just let the plays and called it correctly. But it's hard to say that when I watch a game like Sunday night this week, where Green Bay is going out on up against the 49ers, and as soon as the 49ers start needing calls, and I know, no offense here, Michael, it just starts to come in for that team. And it's not just that game. It seems like every time I'm watching an NFL game, you can almost sense when a team needs that pass interference or they need that hold to stay in the game. It always magically seems to materialize. Do you think the NFL is actually manipulating some of these games, Drew?
I'm gonna keep my own teams out of it. I'm going to keep the Chiefs games out of this talk because I don't want to feel like a homer when I talk about some of the things I saw and disapprove of. But when the NFL voted in to do reviewing of the pass interference calls, and yeah, it prolonged games. Yeah, it made an issue with that. But, I mean, let's all admit, we're okay with a little bit more football, right? A little bit longer stuff. No one's going to get mad about that. And then they took it away. Because when they were like, that's not pass interference, or that is pass interference, or that isn't. And especially when it came down to the last little bit, I think, and this is just me, I kind of think that they were like, oh, this isn't good. Because they're going to start calling us out when we're like, that's blatant, or that's not blatant. And they're obviously seeing it with reviews over and over. Unless you're recording the game, you kind of have to realize that they only show certain things so many times. Unless it's reviewed, it's shown over and over and over. And that is the only reason I kind of want to lean to it beyond anything else I've watched, where it's kind of like, I felt like, yes, it did prolong the time of the game, but I felt like they had a good idea of doing it, and I think when it backfired on, they're like, we're just going to scrap that idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the refs were already kind of committed to, we're not changing anything anyway, right? When it came to those pass interference calls, they're like, it doesn't matter how blatant it is, we're not going to admit we were wrong on it. So I felt like the NFL was kind of in that hard position, or at least the ownership was, not necessarily the NFL with Roger Goodell and the actual governing body, but the when it comes to the owners voting on whether they should get rid of it or not, they were kind of stuck where it's like, all it's doing is slowing down the games. The refs aren't ever admitting they were wrong anyway. What do we gain from it? Really nothing. You're taking 5 minutes and you're burning somebody's time out in a call that they never had a chance to get. Neil goes on to say he thinks not one pass interference penalty was overturned. I think it was 2. I think it was 2 for the entire year. It was 2 out of 30 or something. And it's just, even beyond the interference calls, I do want to talk about that being a big chunk of it, but even beyond that, I didn't feel like that was as much of an orchestration as it was just the NFL saying, or the ref saying, look, we don't want you second-guessing us. We don't want to admit we were wrong on national TV over and over and over again. So, yeah, it's going to be incredibly difficult for any of this to get overturned. And it was kind of like watching Monday Night Football, where I think it was Brian before who said that Dak had that touchdown and he reached the ball over the line. But then they had the challenge or the review, and it was pretty clear he got there to me. But I was like, there's no way they overturn it because they're just not going to admit they made that mistake. It was pretty obvious, in my opinion, that he at least crossed the line before the ball was knocked out of his hands. But the refs were like, we're not going to change it. I think these are two kind of separate points. I don't think that bleeds as much into them kind of trying to orchestrate these games to stay close and stay interesting all the way to the end. I think more than anything, that's the refs not wanting to, admit that they made a mistake. But yeah, I think they both exist. 100% they exist. I don't even need to say I think. I've seen it with my own eyes where there's an obvious call and it just does not go that way outside of my team. So yeah, I 100% believe that you're right. I 100% believe that it exists, and regardless of how wrong they are, they're going to just err on the side of not being wrong. But what I kind of want to focus on is just the arbitrary penalties that kind of come in. And I know we kind of want to stay away from our game specifically, but one example I had was the Colts and the Titans game, where the Colts were trying to catch up this week, and Zach Pascal kind of did like a pretty obvious flop on a couple of these penalties. And I'm sorry, Colts fans, bear with me. But it was pretty obvious it wasn't really a hold or a pass interference where like somebody touches him and then he kind of like throws his hands up and throws himself on the ground, and they needed that conversion, so the penalty kind of rolls in. Do you think there's malicious intent behind some of that? Right? It's not even malicious, but do you think there's some orchestration to some of these penalties where the NFL just wants these games to stay close because they don't want you to change the channel, they don't want you to tune out? Because I do. I'm going to be honest with you, and this is hard to talk about because I love the NFL, and this kind of turns people off of the game, and it makes people not want to watch it. But to me, when I'm watching these games, it's hard to not feel like, regardless of who it is, it's hard to not feel like the NFL isn't trying to keep teams in games late with as many arbitrary penalties as they can throw to make that happen.
One of my...
I think Des caught that one too a long time ago, but we won't get into that, Brian.
One of the issues that I kind of have with this too, and I'm right there with you, is... Sorry, I'm laughing at a text message I just got. Is when does a rule become not callable because it's late game? And I know I try to stay away from Kansas City games, but I'm not even bringing it up anymore. But the Hail Mary play, when does that? There's a lot of refs and former refs that said they would have called it and not called it as far as pass interference because it's like everyone's going for it. There's a lot of hands. There's a lot of jumping up there. When do you call that, and why is it that important late in the game versus early in the game? Or is it better to sit there and throw Hail Marys over and over because you can shove a defender out of your way? I'm just why is it then late in the game not something that you would call pass interference versus like early in the game?
Oh, I agree. Timing is everything too. At least on those Hail Marys, regardless of the game, even outside of the Chiefs. If you look at pretty much any Hail Mary thrown, you can basically do whatever you want. There's no penalty coming in on that. Very rarely you have to basically tackle the receiver while the ball's in the air and hold him on the ground to keep that flag from coming in. 100% I agree with that. The timing is massive. And another example of that I think, again, we talk about orchestration. We talk about the NFL kind of trying to extend these games and keep them close. The NFC Championship last year. If you remember, no penalties were called in that Green Bay-Tampa Bay game, and then you had a soft hold that came in on a third down where the Bucs were going to lose if they didn't get a first down, basically. It's really hard for me to go into these games and say there isn't some slant to it. There isn't some... And it's not in one team's favor or the other necessarily, even though I do think they tend to favor some of the more popular teams for the obvious reason of, hey, if fans are happy, they're going to spend money, all the rest of it. But there is a slant that regardless of what team it is, if you go down by a couple scores and you're in the second half, you're going to start getting the calls to get you back into it. Just because the NFL wants these games to be close and be exciting. But I don't want that. I don't want orchestrated... I don't think most NFL fans do when they watch the product. They don't want it to feel artificial. They don't want it to feel like it's just going to come down to the last few plays and the last possession every week because the NFL is going to do whatever it needs to do to make that happen. And I think it's a big issue with the game. I really do, because I do personally believe, and maybe this is the NBA scandal where the NBA, some of the refs were admitting in the 90s they were shaving points for betting. Maybe this is one of those scandals that 20 years from now we get a ref that retires and they're like, yeah, Roger Goodell told me specifically try to help out the team that's losing when it's more than 9 points, 12 points, whatever. I don't know, but I'm hoping we see a change in it. It's just, it seems like there's a pattern to a lot of these games, and I, for one, hope that's not true.
So one of the last things I want to bring up about this is, so as this year goes on, teams have people that go through every single play, every single penalty, and they start writing lists. And they're like, hey, this ref group doesn't call this. Hey, this ref group calls that. And they will literally have lists for their players, and they'll go over it. They won't admit it because it looks down on the NFL, but I'm telling you right now, they pay people to literally tear apart and digest these plays and penalties and everything and give them to their players and say, hey, this ref on this side will not call this penalty. And I'm going to bring it up as Kansas City because that's the games I pay attention the most to. Is if you talk about last year, our defensive backs were very handsy. They put a lot of hands and a lot of receivers. And I'm not saying their penalties are not penalties, and they were not getting called like all year long. They were not. And then when it became to very important games, you saw those flags throw up there because it was like, in a sense, where it's like they got a little ding in their earpiece, like, hey, they're getting a little too close, call something quick to stop them. And it was so interesting to watch that stuff.
Yeah.
And that is happening, but you'll never hear the teams go out there and just, say, hey, the NFL's screwing us, because they split revenue equally. So there's never going to be a reason why a team would ever go after the person that's paying them millions and millions of dollars to stop it.
And on top of it,
to end my statement, it's just like, this is what we're going to have to accept is the fact that the NFL wants to put out great product. The NFL is never going to be the NCAA, where Alabama and Oklahoma and Ohio State are just the powerhouses over and over. New England and the Patriots. I know we kind of have that with Kansas City now, but it's not going to stay. It's not going to stay like that. It just can't. I'm going to lose interest. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't really like college football that much because none of my teams that I like ever do anything. So I think that they lost enough revenue with the whole like Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling and all that junk, that I think that they are kind of looking at this line and going, okay, we can only do so much. But at the same time with you, Jake, you're saying they're trying to keep these games even, but I also think they're thinking on the other side of it, we're like, well, we can't keep doing it so much where they're going to notice it. But people like you and I, where we dive into these games and we view them again after played, I mean, we see a lot of stuff over and over. We kind of read those, those reports that a lot of people don't read. And it's kind of like interesting when you hear, there might be a little bit something to this.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. You'll never get the media outside of, I guess, us. Are we the media yet? Are we big enough to be the media? I don't know. I don't think so. You'll never get the media to follow it up either because everybody's making money off of this. So, yeah, you'll never have, like, Colin Cowherd or take your pick, any one of your favorite reactors out there come out and say, man, the NFL sure is calling some suspect penalties. No, because they're all getting fat and they're all getting rich off of the product. So, yeah, I agree. I think it's an issue, and I think nobody's going to talk about it. And one thing, when we started doing this, we were like, we never want to be afraid to talk about what we see. And this is something that we've seen.
Paycheck.
Yeah, I know, right? Tell me about it. We're waiting to get out of the red. That's what we're waiting on. Anyway, a couple more of these comments. Brian, he says he's with us, and he says he hopes it's not intentional, but he feels like it is. He also says they need to go back to the real NFL and let them play. If both players are fighting to make a play, then just it needs to go along with no flag. He also says the late close calls are out of control, and they're in an age of money talks. The NFL doesn't want to be the next NBA or the next NASCAR and be struggling with views or sales. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's all about views. It's all about keeping eyes on the product and everything else, and that's why they want these games to be that last. It always comes down to the last drive. It's just hard to not look at it with a cynical eye when, man, a lot of these games sure seem to come awfully conveniently close, especially when the team that's behind is starting to get the bailouts that they need. So, anyway, I'm done griping about it. Just wanted to get your guys' opinion. This wasn't something that I came in. Go ahead.
Sorry. Nah, Michael said he had to go. I was just telling him to see him later.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll take the tinfoil hat off now. I'm not going to ball it up, though. I'm going to just set it on the table because we might need it again here later. Yeah, I don't know. I look at the NFL, and this was something that I didn't come in with such a strong opinion on it that I felt like, oh, nobody can convince me otherwise. I really wanted to hear what you guys had to say about it. So if you do have thoughts on it, let me know in the comments. Am I off base? Am I wrong? Is this just the NFL is calling penalties as they happen? Let me know, because I want to get your opinion on it. I'm sure Drew does as well.